Reem, for having me today, and thank you for giving me the chance to share with you some of our insights and some of the research that we've been working on. It gives me great pleasure. This is not the first time, I have to admit, this is not the first time that I attend TESOL Kuwait, but and it's always a great environment. There is always something. I think it's not only the place, but it's the colleagues and the people that you work with, which I feel obliged to thank for this opportunity. Well, like Dr. Reem mentioned, I would be really interested in sharing some of our insights and some of our research for this acquaintance today, and hopefully build on that later through further research and further insights. Today, the topic that I chose to focus on is something that's, I think, fundamental and close to a lot of people, which is the use of assessment in the classroom. This is, to the people that probably know the work that I do, is very, close to my heart, and especially as a special needs assessor, as a dyslexia expert. The new driver behind the work that I do is very simple. Why don't we utilize or reutilize assessments in a different function? Historically, traditionally, learning takes place in the classroom, assessments happen at the end. But what I've been researching for years now is the mechanism of converting these assessments into something that not only teachers use to probe learning and to ensure attainment of knowledge, but it's something that learners use to create knowledge. They use it as a learning mechanism, so they learn from these assessments. That's really the underpinning concept behind the research that I've been carrying out for the past few years. We published a lot of papers, today I'll be sharing some of these insights and how they can be used practically. So the theme is using assessments for learning, but the core component, the core concept is what we call learning-oriented assessment. Learning-oriented assessment is not a new topic now. We are talking about probably 10 years or 20 years of research. But there's always this new vibe around it whenever we throw it for a discussion or a conference like this, where people, where it ignites some interests, I think, among practitioners in particular. So today I'll be sharing with you some of these insights. There would be an opportunity for us to have a little bit of a chat, a little bit of a discussion around the research and how it can be done in reality. And I think there's another opportunity towards the end of the conference to sit together with other speakers and answer your questions. So if you still have a question that's not answered at the end of this session, please don't worry, because there will be another opportunity to discuss it later. And also, I always welcome any communication afterwards for further discussions or further elaborations. So without further ado, I'll start my research, and I really hope that you will find it enjoyable and useful. The focus of everything I do is driven by one concept, which is making learning in the classroom, particularly post-COVID, much more relevant. How can I make my learning experience in the classroom? And if you're not, so I'm not talking about teaching. I'm talking about learning. I'm talking about that process where we all form a part of as practitioners or as researchers, and how that kind of process can be improved with time. Relevance to me is the underpinning goal of the research that I conduct. It aims at creating a knowledge base as a result of creating that kind of understanding and creating, well, like David Gold calls it, creating knowledge. So learning is simply a process of creating knowledge, and I will share with you some of that research as well in a minute. And I will particularly focus on language learning. language learning and language acquisition for that matter. So all the examples that I'll be highlighting, although they can be applied to other subjects, but I have to, specify that particularly relevant to language learning and language acquisition. So most of the research, or technically the vast majority of the research that I did was mainly on learners of English in particular, English as a second or sometimes as a third language. So all these principles were applied in practice. But before we talk about the practice, let's talk about the reasons and the theory and the motive. What I'm trying to create, although there are lots of different noises or distractors around the learning cycle, but what we're trying to create is to build that level of confidence in language learners in order to expedite their language acquisition. And in order to do that, there's certain elements that I have to go through before I talk about that research. So the starting point is the environment, is what environment I'm building in a language context, in my classroom. And these pictures that you see perhaps are completely different than the actual classes that take place today, particularly post-COVID. How many of us, kind of transformed their classes or the shape of their class, including this conference, from a physical face-to-face to a hybrid model where you have, I think, to deal with one of the most difficult challenges, which is creating that balance between the online users and the in-class users, or the online learners and the in-class learners. So hopefully from this session, we will take a look at some of these elements and how they can be incorporated. I will start with the concept of learning. And I know a lot of people listening to me today got acquainted, or they are basically familiar with the models that I'll be sharing. The main thing that basically we want to reach, or they want to get out of this discussion, is the fact that I need to make my learners more involved in the learning process. And to do that, we've got historical evidence that traditional methods are probably not working, are probably more obsolete, and require huge change or innovation. And that basically can be stretched to universities or institutions worldwide. In one of the research pieces that basically we're working on now in places like Spain and Mexico, where we're testing how language acquisition can be maximized through increasing the use of technology in the classroom. It's, I think, a fascinating result, a fascinating outcome. But in order to do all these different things properly, we have to keep in mind something fundamental, I think, in that cycle. I remember when I was studying in a university, I still recall some of the teachers or some of the professors or some of the classes that I used to attend. I used to remember that personality, as Gary Phillips called it, the class personality that was attached to my memory. With technology today, we have the opportunity to do exactly the same, but in a different format, in a different approach, in a different way. And the starting point to all that change is really working on that climate in the classroom. In this session today, we will look at the use of some of the technological tools to enable us to transform that classroom climate and hopefully it will lead to improved learning. So the point I'm trying to make here is that in order to drive change in your classroom and help improve knowledge attainment, we have to start from one point, which is the classroom climate, the personality of a classroom. And I understand that this is probably much easier said than done, simply because of the challenges of online learning. Since the start of this year until now, this is perhaps the fourth conference that I take part in. And every conference, there's always one question that I'm asked. And this question simply is, how can we create a much more motivating environment to our learners if they are embarking on digital learning, if they are based, especially when we have to deal with large classes. And I think the more I think about this question and this answer, I'm the more convinced of the importance of the tools that I'll be sharing today. And the reason behind that kind of sense that I have is driven from some theoretical experiments that were done many years ago. And it's based on Kolb's definition of knowledge. For me, what I base all my research on is the concept of learning seen in a different eye. To me, and to many colleagues that I work with, learning is simply creation of knowledge through our own experiences. I love that definition. It gives me freedom. As an educator, it gives me freedom to work on so many levels with my learners.
هذه ليش منشورة هذه؟
Particularly when it comes to digital learning, the opportunity for us to explore relevant content that can be used in a classroom in whatever format, whether it's digital or non-digital, is based on that notion that the learning is simply the creation of knowledge through our experiences. i.e., what I'm trying to say here, that there is no actual knowledge created unless we as learners are involved in it directly. So in other words, giving a learner a textbook to memorize is not the effective method that I'm talking about today. I'm talking about learning where the learner is the center of whatever takes place, whether it's an online classroom or a face-to-face classroom. Kolb talked about the exponential learning theory, and he talked about the modern learning style movement as put together in a specific diagram, as you can see on the screen. I'm not very much attached to diagrams and graphs. I'm a believer of freedom. I'm a believer of freedom in the classroom, in flexibility in learning, in being able to express ourselves freely, whether we are educators or learners. I'm a believer in the fact that our learners should build their own pace of learning, should have the autonomy to learn in their own way, in their own sense. This feeling is empowered by my strong attachment to the concept of inclusion. And for me, in my own perspective, I don't think that basically we'll be able to accommodate all our learners unless we trust them. And trusting them is not a simple process. It's not just something theoretical that we will have to throw in the classroom. I tell them, I trust you, go do whatever you want to do. That's definitely not what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is that I will have to come up with a mechanism. I will have to come up with a tool that will allow my learners, my students, to extract or to distill the best in themselves. And the solution to all these different things in my book is assessments, as you will see in a few minutes. Going back to Kolb's exponential learning theory, Kolb says that to learn means that you have to pass through various stages. It starts with the experiment, with the reflection of that experiment, with the actual abstract conceptualization of that experiment, to trying to synthesize the results and reflect and so plan for how you can use the results of that experiments in the real world. In another word, if I'm teaching a specific grammar piece, for example, to my learners, I will have to, of course, give them a practical sense where they will get involved in a conversation or a structure, and then they will have to discover, discover what works and what doesn't work, and they have to conceptualize it, to think about it, to see the actual criteria associated with that process, and then plan how they can use it elsewhere. This notion is fascinating. It's fascinating because it gives me some grounds that I can build on, because in that cycle, there is no control. In that cycle, there is no place where I, as a teacher, can share knowledge in the first place. What I'm trying to say here is knowledge doesn't have to be shared. Knowledge is created. I create it as a learner. I create knowledge from my own experiment, from the exercise or the activity that I do, from the assessment that I undertake. And that will not work unless we have those positive feelings. You will not enjoy this session unless you like it. You will not enjoy these sessions unless you feel confident that what this session would give you is something useful for your class. When I started the conversation, I said that I will give you something that you can use, so you've got high expectations of what you would expect. And that's increasing your motivation. We have to think of the psychology of learning as part of the learning itself. I will not learn if I'm forced to learn. I will not learn if I'm forced to do an assessment at the end of a course. Unfortunately, this has been happening for many years. Unfortunately, the concepts that basically we're trying to say and these ideas that basically we're talking about now may come across as theoretical and not realistic, simply because of the legacy and the heritage of the old traditions of learning, particularly in our regions here, where I would give my learners a textbook, go and read it. We still do that I still do that, unfortunately, for my PhD students. Read this book and come back to discuss. But you see, the purpose of our using reading is not to share knowledge, but to help you discover knowledge on your own. So the reason why I give my research students a piece of reading is not for me to share the ideas of a researcher or to share or to tell them how they should think. It is for me to ignite or to plant the seed for them to challenge, to think, to plan, to synthesize. And that's, I think, why these kind of ideas are crucial. And as I said, that positive feeling is driven internally from my motivational force. I'm a big believer of what some research talked about in the past, historically, back in the 80s, about the expectations and the value or the power of expectations. And, for me, I think it's very simple. If I am to succeed in creating knowledge, i.e. in learning, as a learner, I will have to have a high motivational force. And having a higher motivational force is a result of two variables: my expectations and the value of those expectations. You are probably listening to me today because I told you that you can expect few things, and you have high expectations of how relevant these tools can be for you when you go back to your class. And that kind of generated a higher, stronger, more powerful motivational force. And that motivational force will either go down with time or will go up. The direction by which it will take in few probably minutes or hours or days, it depends on the duration of the course, depends on various variables. But the starting point you see is me, the learner. In this instance, it's you. The reason why you're interested, the reason why you're listening to me today is because you want to take something from this session and apply it, because you probably have you have some challenges in your classroom, or you simply want to improve what you do in your classroom. You want to be a better teacher, not because you're not good enough, but simply because there's always room to do things differently. There's always another way of doing things, and what if that other way is probably more successful than the current way? Going back to the core of this discussion, which is the cycle that I'm following now to create more positive learning, is these feelings in the classroom. And these feelings are various, happen or take place because of various activities or actions. These feelings happen as reactions of other people. Or because of the feedback that I give, or the compliments that I share, or because of the results that I give at the end of the assessment. I really want you, today to think about those ideas and how they can be applied in your kind of environment. The value of my learning depends ultimately on what motivational force my learners have, and that's associated with their expectations, and the starting point is different variables. As a researcher, for me, I kind of quantify everything and convert everything in my head into variables. What are the influences to that cycle? And for me, there are too many. I try to narrow down a few of them, but I'm sure you would agree that they are highly relevant to any context, whatever the level that you're teaching. The feedback is so powerful. Compliments is so powerful. The results of the work that you do is so powerful. There's nothing more frustrating than not getting the right result that you deserve. There's nothing more frustrating than not giving the right feedback. Or, how many times do we fall in a situation where learners get their essay, or I'm not going to go into the conversation of ChatGPT and how technology is changing writing, because that's a different discussion altogether. But I think feedback is changing. I think the way we, kind of perceiving all these different changes is changing. And that will only work if we develop that level of trust and autonomy that I started the conversation with. If the process doesn't support that autonomy and discovery journey, then there are various ways of cheating that takes place in the classroom. Like I said, with the advancements of many apps and applications that we started seeing in the last few months and even years. It's astonishing. It's astonishing to think of a mechanism that will allow me to write an essay completely without me interfering in that writing process. But us, as educators, I think we have a much bigger responsibility these days. And our responsibility starts with that creation of that climate. And like I said, we have a powerful tool that there is no way we can escape it, or learners can escape it, or technology, if if the advancements that are taking place are trying properly to deviate us from. There are so many positiveness. However, there are so many scenarios where learning is not successful. There are so many situations where we do not feel that we delivered what we ought to do. Just for the sake of time, and just because I'm conscious of what we need to cover and just allowing some time at the end, I won't really kind of throw this question now, but you can elaborate on your own if you like. So unsuccessful learning takes place even in the most advanced of classes, even in the most experienced teachers' classes, and it happens for different reasons. And it starts with a journey. I'm not talking about the formal learning only. I'm talking about the informal learning as well. Us, how many times, or how many of us really kind of went through experiments and experiences that were not successful? I remember from my kids when they started learning how to ride a bike, how many times they were unsuccessful. How many times they fell down and I had to convince them that this is so easy, although they fell down and they hurt themselves. I had to convince them that you have to try again and you have to do it better and you have to learn to avoid the mistakes that you made and learn from them to make you a much better rider. In many cases, and I know a lot of kids in our neighborhood here that were not able to ride a bike, simply because they didn't have a successful learning journey that led to a successful outcome, which is the ability to ride a bike. It could have been a mistake in giving feedback. It could have been the mechanism, the tool or the bicycle itself was not good enough. But most dangerously, I think, it could have been the environment wasn't supportive enough. And I really would like to invite everybody listening to Bean to think of that bicycle example as, a clear example of what happens in our own learning cycles. What happened to that kid that couldn't even ride a bike after 3 or 4 attempts because they gave up could happen to any learner in our classes today. And that's why we have so many people embarking on their end of course exams, not getting the right results. It shouldn't be the case. In theory, if I'm building a course and I'm a curriculum specialist, if I'm building the right course, it should basically accommodate at least 95% of my of the level of my learners. I won't allow, and that's why we do these placement tests at the start of any program. Why will I allow somebody that's A2 proficient to sit in a B2 class? That won't work. So in theory, all learners have the same or similar capabilities. It's just us not creating that right environment. And I'm here placing a bigger importance of the role of the teacher in the classroom, not as an educator to share knowledge, like I said, but simply starting with that bicycle example, not creating the right environment to learn. And we sometimes do that unintentionally. We sometimes do that for various reasons. And sometimes it happens because of certain barriers that takes place in the classroom itself. Whether these barriers are educational, cultural, language barriers, whatever they are. I think today we've got more barriers than before when we have today as well digital poverty. When I don't have, for example, the right digital platforms, don't have an iPad, or I don't have a laptop, or the right speed of an internet to record or to upload my different things. But please do not only think of one classroom example. Think of a wider public. Think of a country. Think of a nation. Think globally of what's taking place. So what I would invite everybody really is to analyze their unsuccessful learning experience. And then in this example, I try to summarize or narrow down some of the reasons that I personally came up with, or either either thought of or seen other people doing it, or I did it myself. Examples that I see so many times is that learners are not encouraged to make mistakes. Negative feedback, critical feedback given in a negative way, there's no motivation. There is a fear of failure, particularly when the pressure is high, when I have to progress to a university program, but I have to get to a B2 level before I can be admitted. And, I have lots of financial and economic reasons behind my back that will probably create extra burden on my shoulders to perform better. So what I'm trying to say, that to our learning, there are many, many factors that will affect it, and many of them would lead to unsuccessful learning. So to summarize what I was saying so far, is that we need to compile a set of criteria, if you like, to create that successful learning environment. It starts with the wanting, with the motivation, like I said, with the motivational force, with the value and the expectation, i.e. the need, the ability to do things and make it more relevant, the practice, and then the feedback and the power of feedback and seeing the actual results afterwards, and then the reflection and the ability to synthesize. These 5 factors, I think, to me, and I do have a statistical evidence to support these statements. Our research indicates that learning will not be successful unless we have these 5 factors in place. And the quality of our learning will be proportionate to the improvement of these variables: the motivation, the need, the doing, the feedback, and the reflection or the digestion. What I always call my teachers and the teacher that I work with is to create an ownership mechanism. Teachers or learners in general should gain ownership of their own learning. We will not face whatever challenges, whatever technological advancements coming our way, unless we teach our learners to gain ownership of their own learning. And I would not do that unless they realize the value and the expectation of their learning. It doesn't have to be, I'm not talking about the educational strategy per country. I'm talking about what we can do in our classrooms. I'm talking about the little bit of work that we can add in our own classrooms. So if I am to summarize before I move to the practical part, I really invite everybody to take a look at this diagram and make some sense out of it. The starting point, or why you decided in the first instance to join this conference, is because you want or you need. I want to learn, or I need to come up with a solution. And then you do things, and that's why I'm adding the practical component. And then I give you feedback, or you get feedback from different sources, and then you reflect. That is the active learning model that we are calling, or that we are promoting. And I think it's a fascinating journey. If you're thinking about that journey over the years, of what or how our practices as educators changed over the past 50 years, if you like, from the teaching, the telling model, where I tell you what you need to do, to the learning, where students are more engaged with the learning mechanisms. I have more emphasis on learning, to the discovery model. And the discovery model now, I'm adding another or a fourth tier now that started to grow properly in the last few months, which is the discovery/autonomy model. We're calling for a model whereby learners can create, can discover, and can move away from creating a fixed mindset to a growth mindset. Well, I'm a responsible learner. I'm able to challenge myself. I want to challenge myself by discovering something new. And there's no age attached to this, I don't think. It can start from very young age. We do that in the reality of things. We do that, with the first experiment of this, I do it, is with little kids, with infants, when they are born. The first thing I do, I go and check the hearing, for example, to see the impact on their development, in their overall development. I check their hearing, I check their sight. If they can see colors, if they can distinguish the colors, so I can refer them to a medical practitioner afterwards. But from my perspective as an educator, learning starts from the moment we are born. The mechanism or the tool by which basically I would properly help, to a certain extent, solve or come up with a solution to these challenges and issues is using an assessment. And there has been a lot of research around the importance of assessment and what purposes assessments can be used for, and what are the differences between assessments, and how can we write different assessments for different purposes, and how can we improve the actual use of assessments. And we saw historically a great evolution of assessment practice. It started really many years ago. I remember the first C1 exam that Cambridge did more than 100 years ago was 6 hours long. It was more than 6 hours long in duration. That was 100 years ago. It was 6 hours, and it barely managed to capture all the skills and the characteristics of the learner that were very useful for either educational purposes or employment purposes, because it focused on abstract, static skills like grammar, for example, or translation. There was a big section on translation. So a journey of over 100 years old led to here, to this conversation today, where we're talking about a different use of assessment. We were talking about assessments that give a positive feedback. We're talking about assessments that will be valid for today's world, for today's classroom. We're talking about assessments that are reliable and they are practical. A positive impact in assessment, I think, is a very powerful statement. Later last year, then towards the end of last year, Cambridge launched its impact framework. It's now available on our website. And the impact framework is mainly a framework by which we kind of control the work that we do in different places. So I will now talk about the general sentiment of how that journey of assessment transformed and how we can use it to create successful learning in the classroom. In the past, we had two main methods of assessments. We had the summative assessment and we had the formative assessment. We're talking about standardized assessments, we're talking about classroom assessments, we're talking about assessment of learning, and we're talking about assessments for learning. A mechanism by which in the classroom I give my students an exercise and activity to check that they understood. This can be easily seen in various subjects when we're talking about, for example, physics or mathematics or chemistry or science or whatever, where I give them an exercise in the class to practice. In a language classroom, when we're basically trying to give them a quick quiz at the end of a course or at the end of the day or at the end of a learning outcome. And then we have at the end of the session, we have the standardized summative assessment, which is a general statement by which we measure how much we remember or retain from our own learning. So in that structure, we've got various layers. We're creating now a new layer. We're creating a new stage by which we're using assessment as learning. We're using assessment as a mechanism by which we are allowing our learners to learn. How does this happen? How can we do that in reality? I started this discussion today by highlighting how important it is to create the right environment. And the right environment will not start or will not be created unless we have a certain level of trust. And for that level of trust to be established, or that level of autonomy to be given to my learners, we have to create some sort of a mechanism or relationship by which the role of an educator is simply facilitating learning and, in this instance, creating a systematic relationship where assessments that are summative, that are standardized, are used formatively. I said, summative or standardized assessments are used formatively. This is a very interesting statement, and that statement is a result of a lot of research. How can we be confident or using summative assessment formatively? i.e., how can I break and why should I use a summative assessment in the classroom if I can? I will tell you why. The reason why we end up with third-party assessment, or the reason why we end up with end-of-course assessment, is because there is some sort of quality mechanism or quality check, and then that will ensure that this assessment tool has four main criteria: valid, reliable, has a positive impact, and of course, up to date. So that means technically, if I have these characteristics and throw them in the classroom in my formative assessment, that means the assessment will basically be at the end of each block. I'm creating blocks of learning. I will ensure that each block is completed, is assessed, monitored, and fed back, because feedback is crucial, as we saw, for the success of the learning journey in the classroom. So what I'm creating here is a learning outcome-oriented class. So my session or my curriculum is ultimately based on or driven by the learning outcomes that I want my learners to achieve. So technically here, I'm giving more autonomy to my learners, and I'm utilizing, I'm repurposing, reusing the external standards of the materials I'm using in the class to help my learners utilize these assessment tools for learning purposes. And the main driver, and I'm sure many people that are following my work would be able to see that this diagram on the screen here is not a new diagram. I've been using this diagram to justify different theories and different practices throughout my research years. And this represents a typical classroom where we have different layers of learning and different layers that we have to respond to as educators. Now, it's a very important element of the success of my learning journey to understand this diagram really well, not only understand it, but be able to respond to it quite effectively. I do the same diagram to highlight or to talk about my inclusion research, and I do the same thing for the use of assessment in the classroom. Giving learners more autonomy will establish an individualized pace by which we are able to learn more effectively. But how will this work? I'm just conscious of the time. I think we're doing okay. Learning in general happens as a result of different variables, as we agreed, but it also happens in two channels, two streams. It happens formally as a result of the curriculum and the learning outcomes, and it happens naturally through the natural acquisition of knowledge. It happens naturally when I learn from my peers. If I'm put in a language speaking, in an English speaking environment, I'm forced to speak English. Whereas if I'm learning English in an environment where I'm talking in another language, it makes it more challenging because a big part of our learning takes place naturally outside the classroom. And one of our key objectives is really to link what happens with the classroom with the external world. And that's really what I started the conversation with. I started the first slide by saying that I want to make, my mission is to create a more relevant structure to the assessment tools and activities in every classroom for every level, whether it's primary school to postgraduate PhD level. It's the same thing. We learn naturally as well as formally. So that means technically, if we are able to produce a more effective learning cycle, a more successful learning cycle, we have to follow a pattern, and that pattern takes different shapes. My starting point of that cycle is with the learning outcomes. I need to have a learning outcome-oriented curriculum. I need to ensure that every activity I do in the classroom is linked with a purpose, with a reason why I'm doing it. And we're lucky as English language educators, as language experts, we are lucky because we've got the Common European Framework of Reference that gives us a lot of power, a lot of depth to what we do in the classroom. So for each level here, we've got what we call the can-do statements. And the can-do statements are descriptors of the skills that each learner should have. And for that matter, we've got our starting point. So we've got the learning objectives clearly stated in these can-do statements. So I create a course based on these learning outcomes. So if I'm teaching a B1 course, that means technically I would start with the can-do statements for B2 level, for B1 level, and then I will. That's where the difference starts. I start, instead of giving a book or a reading task or me teaching, I will start with a task. I will start with an assessment. And I will give this assessment after understanding, of course, the background of my learners. I will give it to a group of learners together, either through self-selected teams or through pre-structured groups. And then I record, and these records are informal, of course. So I record my observations. Whether you do this class at home, or you do this activity at home, you do it while you're traveling, or you do it in the bedroom, you do it in the classroom, it doesn't really make a big difference to me. What makes a big difference is the outcome. So I'm converting my point of attention here as an educator from the device or from the creation of an activity or a game that's so common, that used to be so common back in the day, to help English language teachers, to something much more practical, something that will take my learners into a journey of discovery. And then my ultimate value as an educator lies in the feedback that I give to my learners. And that feedback is so powerful because, like we saw in the previous slides, it could lead to unsuccessful learning if the feedback was not suitable. And I repeat that cycle. I repeat it for each one of the learning outcomes. And that's what I create, how I create a record of achievement. So that means when the end of the course comes, that record indicates all the key achievements, all the key observations. And then in that case, even if my learners had to, do a summative assessment, like a national test or IELTS or whatever test that they have to take, then they can do quite well because they're equipped with the key skills. So they are able to retain knowledge much more effectively compared to a traditional classroom. One key example of this, I think helps a lot of teachers worldwide, is the concept of a flipped classroom. And obviously, if we had time, I would have shared with you one of the videos that you would, I think that you would find kind of interesting to look at, and it gives you a different insight to how that notion of learning-oriented assessment and the learning-oriented classroom can be put into practice. And the results, the summative results at the end of a course would be much better. But today, like I said at the beginning, the biggest challenge I think lies in the amount of technology that we have. And this technology, like I said at the beginning or during the discussion now, is quite scary. What we're witnessing is something huge. I think this is happening for the first time at this pace, at this powerful level where, technology is and AI is really transforming how we as educators should respond. But nonetheless, I trust in technology, and I think that there is no way to fight the misuse of technology unless we use technology for it again. So the only way to fight the misuse of technology is to use technology itself. And to do that effectively, and I will allow, I'm so keen on allowing some time really to answer because I see that there are so many questions asked. So I'm really keen on allowing some time at the end. But before we go there, let me just share some useful tips that I think would be quite helpful. The use of technology today includes the use of various resources. And I talked about that box in a minute. I talked about that diagram where we looked at the different activities that take place. But the reality of it, that this diagram will not be as effective unless I use technology for it. In the region here, perhaps, I think one of the biggest challenges that we all face as teachers is either in the writing or in the reading. And it's a fact that a lot of negative results, or not negative results, but the lower results among a larger cohort of students take place through or happen in either the writing or the reading. Cultures in certain countries do not really encourage reading as much as they should. They're great at listening. Their listening skills are so good that you get probably a B2 learner in listening, but compared to a B1 or A2 even in some cases in writing. And a lot of that, I mean, I don't always blame the history or the legacy or the traditions or the culture itself, but I also fall victim to not filling that gap properly in the classroom. And I think that's something very important we have to consider really, really carefully.
Dr. Hisham, I think I'm going to have to stop you as we have other sessions going on.
Okay. I think my session finishes at 2. That's why I'm.
Oh, it's actually 1:45, but
Okay.
I just wanted to give you a glimpse of the auditorium and just allow you to see everyone.
Okay.
All right. So there we go. All right, if you could just switch your camera. There we go. All right. So can we get a hello to everyone? All right, wonderful.
Hey, thank you very much for. Yeah, I can see the session. I can see the auditorium. And apologies, for some reason I thought that my session, I still have some time in the session left. So apologies if I took more than time than I should. I really have more things that I wanted to share, but I will stop here anyway. Dr. Reem, once again, apologies for taking longer than I should. Yeah, and I think I'll stop here. I was planning on having some questions at the end, but I'll stop here.
Thank you so much. So if you could just mute your mic for a second. There we go. All right, so we have a session running right. It's actually, so thank you to everyone for being here. See you in the other room.